Hi, welcome to Tonai Talks. My name is Dr. Karis Rees, and today I've got with me Carly Williams, who's an occupational therapist. Today we're going to be talking about inside the senses. As you can see on the screen there, we've got our QR code so that you're able to scan that and view our other Tonai Talks. We are on YouTube. We're also on Spotify and Amazon Music. So please check out our other Tonai Talks on a variety of different subjects and some subjects that are very relevant to today's talk as well. So getting into it, let's talk with Carly Williams. Hi, Carly.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us today. And I can't wait to get into the talk for today, which is Inside the Senses. I know you're an occupational therapist.
Yeah.
What is that? Tell us a bit about what that means.
Okay, so as occupational therapists, we work with a range of people, and for me specifically, that's children.
Okay.
We see our occupations as things that we need to do on a daily basis, so that can range from kind of brushing your teeth to going to school and writing, going to the park,
Okay.
and anything that a child needs to be able to do but isn't able to because
Right.
of any reason. Today we're going to be focusing on senses.
Yeah.
That is where we would come in as an occupational therapist to kind of support strategies, interventions, adaptations, environmental modifications, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay. So yeah, because occupational therapists, we often think of like, okay, that's about a job, a career, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But actually, I suppose you can see it in terms of jobs that we need to do in order to function, isn't it?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that right?
Yeah, so we see our occupations as our activities. So there's three different types of occupation within our world, which is our self-care, which would be your kind of washing, dressing, your productivity, which would be going to school in children's case, or going to work for an adult, and then your leisure activities, which might be going out with friends, socializing, going to the cinema, etc. So that's our occupations in our world.
Right. Okay. So it does stretch across a lot of different things.
Yes.
But I suppose it all adds up to living a happy, healthy, active life, is it?
And this is exactly it, yeah. So the ultimate goal is kind of participation, to be able to engage within your world, and participate within your occupations as much as possible. And that then kind of really supports well-being for children and for parents.
Yeah, it's a really important thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So are you saying that a child may come to you if they're not able to complete any of these tasks that you said, these jobs? So, for example, if they can't look after themselves, or if they can't go to school, or if they can't, engage in social activities or sporting activities.
Yeah, and that's exactly our kind of referral criteria, really. It's the inability to engage with those functional tasks or those occupations. So it might be a parent will say, I've got a child who isn't able to access bathing or showering, or isn't able to go out to a supermarket because they get too dysregulated, or is really struggling in school or to get to school. So our referrals therefore are very varied. No 2 days are the same in our world, which is very nice. And we get a range of different kind of things come to us. I've got two roles. I've got a split post. So I work the beginning of my week for the local education authority, and then the end of the week for the NHS.
Okay, how are those jobs different then?
So yeah, they're very different in that my local authority job is to support teaching staff.
Okay.
So that would be a teacher or a teaching assistant or an ALNCO would come to me and kind of say, I've got a child in my class who is struggling with, for example, handwriting or coordination, or their sensory needs are getting in the way of their ability to sit and attend, they're dysregulated. So lots of those kinds of presentations. And then my role there is to kind of support the teacher to unpick what strategies they could put in place. And we offer training as part of that role.
So when you say about helping schools, then, for example, you mentioned about things like, like physical activities, like being able to write, which I understand. Then you mentioned things like sensory overload. I mean, what would that look like in school?
So lots of children really struggle to maintain a regulated state for a number of reasons.
And by regulated, you mean
regulated, I suppose when you're regulated, you're able to, you're calm. You're in a state that you're able to learn. On the flip side of that, when you're dysregulated, you might see a child who, needs to move a lot more or is not able to focus or is upset, is visibly overexcited. There's a range of kind of emotions we might feel in a child that is dysregulated. So yeah, it might look like any of those things, and it's quite complex. So actually unpicking that can be really helpful.
Yeah. So in a way, it's like there's so much more to it than, as we kind of see on the outside as, a child being able to write. There could be some, particular difficulties that they may have, regardless of how much support they've had and practice. As we know that children would expect to have poor handwriting and for it to hurt to write, but that should develop over time, and you'd get involved if it hasn't.
That's it.
And again, with the dysregulation you talked about, is about we would expect children to find parts of the school environment overstimulating, or they may have poor attention, so they kind of get up out of their seat and have a look around, or they might find assemblies kind of difficult to sit through because they might be a bit bored, for example, but then there comes a point where actually we can see it as more than just the normal level of dysregulation, discomfort, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's really true, because we all have periods of the day where we might feel that something is too much for us, we're dysregulating. And times like the dinner hall are very noisy, very smelly, lots going on, very busy. And for lots of children, it's quite typical to find that a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
But as you said, really, it's when it becomes a bit more than that. And teachers will kind of come and say, well, okay, well, we've put in all the things that we know.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
Yeah.
So we work really jointly together, and we work with lots of other teams within the authority to kind of pick apart what's going on for that child, and what can we try to make their school day a lot more achievable, and to support their not just their learning, but their well-being in school as well.
Yeah, because ultimately that's what we want, our children to be happy, because they need to feel kind of content and, regulated, as you say, to be able to learn, isn't it? And, engage well with education. So tell me a bit more about your role with the NHS. How is that different?
So it is a very different role, because we work more directly than with families. So we get referrals primarily from parents, but anybody can refer a child to the service. When we work then with those families, the child's kind of difficulties, I suppose, are more home-based. So parents will come to us with the more kind of self-care, or again, quite often dysregulation. We have a lot of children who might manage well in school, but then at home, a bit like a bottle of pop will explode when they come home. I might come and say, are there any strategies that you can recommend that we can try? So, and we work a bit more directly with children. So we might do intervention blocks. We might go and do home visits. We might bring children into our centre. We've got really lovely facilities in the centre, like a really nice sensory room. And so
what would an intervention block look like, sorry?
So it very much depends. Everything is very goal directed and goal focused. And that is very child centered. So we'll only work on what a parent or child really wants to work on, because it's motivating for them. So at the very beginning of an intervention block, our first kind of key priority will be goal setting. What's most important for that family as a whole, and what's important for the child, what's important for the parents. And then we'll set a mutually agreed goal. And then the intervention sessions will aim to meet that goal. So for a child with coordination difficulties, it could be breaking down those tasks, looking at what it is they're struggling with. Maybe it's tying their shoelaces, and we'll look at that, and we'll give lots of adaptive approaches. We might practice with them. We might do lots of other assessments to work out, okay, so what are the underlying functional difficulties here? And we might uncover that maybe they've got a specific area of difficulty, maybe this is their balance, and then we might work on those things. If it's dysregulation, or if it's kind of sensory strategies, then quite often we'll work with parents to help them identify what strategies they can implement at home themselves. Because coming to a block is great, but actually being able to implement strategies at home that you can do day in, day out is what's going to make the biggest difference to the child.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right, because it's about that whole family kind of adapting as well, isn't it?
That's right.
And putting those daily kind of support mechanisms in place.
Yeah.
And as much as your intervention block is really helpful,
Yeah.
actually so much can be done at home, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is really empowering for the family as well.
It is, and that's what makes a big difference. Doing something once a week for 6 weeks doesn't make the big changes. It's the day in, day out. And supporting parents to feel empowered with kind of having more knowledge or having additional, strategies to go away and try is brilliant, because it's kind of they're empowered then to make changes and supports everybody's well-being.
Yeah, because that's what it's so important, isn't it? It's not about as you in your special area, and me as well. It's about sharing that knowledge, isn't it? It's not about us gatekeeping it, holding it on, and us being the specialists. It's about us sharing what we know to help each family, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's great. You're basically turning all parents into mini occupational therapists at home, which is great, isn't it? Because it helps, and that's why we do Tonight Talks, is to help parents to be able to access knowledge that they can apply that at home, and make those massive changes. Because like you say, a block of intervention is nothing like daily support that can be done in the home by the family.
Exactly. And I think I remember back a long time ago when I did my first kind of sensory training, the course leader said to us, "You'll leave the end of this week with a pair of sensory goggles." And I always think of that when I meet with parents, and I kind of say, "Look, I'm going to give you a pair of sensory goggles so you can see it from a different lens." And obviously you need to put your other goggles on as well. Not everything is sensory, but it does kind of, it helps you to be a bit of a detective. So
and that's the great thing, isn't it? It's being a detective, because how often do we come across moments where we think, oh, there just wasn't a trigger? We hear that a lot, don't we? And actually, it's so important to put those goggles on and be that detective to go, okay, what could be going on here that I'm not seeing?
Exactly.
Because there's always something that can explain it, as much as it can be really difficult to find. And even us as professionals, sometimes it takes us a lot longer, even with our goggles on. But we do get there eventually. And I think that's important for parents to know that, they're not alone in this as well.
No.
As much as it does seem, very complex and very kind of hard to understand, we can get to that point where we can certainly make positive changes for the kids.
100%. And I think it's important to remember as well that you don't always see what's happening inside somebody's body. So you might have a child that presents as being regulated and being okay, but inside they might be feeling dysregulated. There might be some kind of, turmoil going on that we don't necessarily see. So we've all had to have days where you have to put on a front or a brave face, and you actually inside are, maybe your stomach is churning, or you're worried about something. And the world might not know that you feel that way. And children do the same thing. They go into school and they put on, what their best, they give the best versions of themselves if they can. So sometimes we might not see a trigger, but it might be something that's internalized as well. So
and that's important to recognize, isn't it? That even though they appear to be coping, it's like we talk about that swan gliding across the pond, but the legs are crazily going at speed underneath, isn't it?
Underneath.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. It's really good to understand your role and what that means for parents, and how parents can access support as well, and schools as well. So that's really helpful. And so, moving on to what we're talking about today, we're talking about the senses, and we've talked a little bit about that, but what do we mean about the senses?
Okay, so we are all sensory human beings. So our senses are working all the time, 24/7, even when we're sleeping, taking information and processing that information. We've got 8 senses. So we've got 5 senses that everybody knows about. And within the kind of sensory world, we call those our exteroceptors. And what that basically means is we're reliant on external information. So clothing touching your skin, for example, a noise in the environment, a smell. So that's external information. And those 5 senses are the ones that we know. So our sense of smell, taste, touch, sight, and sound.
Of course, because you're taking information in, aren't you, through those senses?
So whether it's whatever it may be, it's always something that's outside of your body, that the body is kind of taking that information in. And the sensory integration process, we talk a lot about sensory integration. All that means is how your brain responds to the process. So your brain's taking the information via your senses and is responding to that. Sometimes that response is to filter that information out because it's not important.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need to respond to it, and it varies, and our responses can fluctuate as well. So sometimes when we're very stressed, we will respond a lot more than when we're not stressed.
Yeah.
I always use the driving analogy. So when you get lost, so everybody listens to music, drives along, you can listen to music, your auditory system is taking that in, enjoying it, and then you get lost, and the first thing everybody does is turn the music off. And that's because the brain now is stressed because you're lost. So that auditory filtering is like, right, I need to get rid of any external information, any external noise. We might take our coat off at that point because all of a sudden now we're hot. So we want to get rid of all that sensory information because it now feels like overload, whereas 5 minutes ago it was enjoyable. So we fluctuate. We've got 3 additional senses that are kind of less well known about. And that's because they're more internalized. So they are called the vestibular sense, which is our sense of movement. The proprioception sense, which is our kind of internal sense of where we are in space. And then we've got something called interoception, which is internal signals that tell us things like when we're hungry, when we're full, when we need the toilet, when we're thirsty, when you're too hot, too cold, when you're in pain.
And I guess that kicks in when you said about getting lost in the car. Because you're starting to notice things in your body that are changing. It's really common for lots of children to have poor interoception, and there's a real strong link then with a child's regulation, because if they don't know what it feels like when they need to go to the toilet but something's feeling strange, then that can become quite stressful for the child. So the 3 internal senses are very closely linked to our regulation. So the vestibular sense, which is the sense that detects movement, is located within our inner ears. So every time our head moves, this our vestibular system picks up that information. But what's that for? That vestibular.
It basically keeps us upright. So if we didn't have a vestibular sense, you would not know when your head had moved forward, and you wouldn't make those kind of postural adjustments. So if you were on a train, for example, and you were stood up and it suddenly came to a stop, your head would whoosh forward. Your vestibular system would notice that change. It's all fluid in your inner ears that picks up, and your brain would go, right, I need to grab onto something. I need to not, instead of just basically falling over. So it helps us with balance. It works really closely with our vision as well, to be able to kind of look around and keep your head, move your head, but still focus on, a certain point. Really good for things like copying off the board, reading. So lots of things you wouldn't necessarily think are linked with movement, but it is really important for that.
So when you mentioned about the vision and the vestibular, the perception coming in combined there, is that why some people get car sick then?
So an over responsive vestibular system, so a vestibular system that over responds to information, is really typically presented as being car sick, not really wanting your feet off the ground, so avoiding any kind of rides or roller coasters, not wanting to spin, getting dizzy really easily. And then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum for children who are under responsive and seek that, and will spin and spin and spin and not get dizzy, or will just run around and need to constantly seek that movement.
Does that change over time then?
It does, to some extent. So children's brains are always developing, as we know, and lots of children will seek a lot of vestibular input when they're really little, and that will kind of taper off. It's really common for children's vestibular system to continue to develop, and the more that it develops and fine-tunes and is kind of able to pick up that information, then that does change. From the perspective of being over-responsive to vestibular input, that doesn't always change. So you'll find that children who are typically car sick will not kind of get to a certain age and suddenly go, oh, right, I'm ready for a roller coaster now. They'll tend to possibly be quite over-responsive. Or always be quite over-responsive. But you will find that children's kind of need to seek that input does slow down, but again, it's not having a sensory difference isn't something you necessarily grow out of, if that makes sense. But like everything else, as you develop, as children go through developmental milestones, and as they develop and change, the senses change along with them.
So I can understand now when we're thinking about our occupations or those jobs that we've got to do in the day. as much as we've got information coming at us from outside, which would be through our senses, those five that you mentioned, with the smell, the sight, the hearing, taste. We've got those three internal ones, which, of course you wouldn't notice, would you? Because you've got to be inside that person's head and mind to be able to understand those. And so I guess, does that where the misunderstanding about not knowing triggers and things like that for someone, would that come from those three senses?
Yeah, I think so. There's generally more understanding around the five senses that are more commonly known.
Yeah.
And I think for us ourselves, up until I learned about this when I qualified as an occupational therapist, I didn't know I had a proprioceptive system and a vestibular system, because they work well. And this is the key message really, is that when they're working well, they're completely automatic and they're unconscious. Which is great. It's like breathing, our body does all these lovely things that we don't have to think about until they don't work as well. And that's when then, you kind of notice those things. And I think, there's a lot of misconception around those senses, because we just don't know about them until we have to learn about them. And so I think it's really easy to spot a child who maybe is tactile defensive or over responsive to tactile input, because they suddenly don't want to get messy, or they won't wear clothing with labels. They don't want to get involved in tasks like brushing their teeth, because they can't cope with the tactile overload with that activity. It's less easy to spot a child with poor proprioception and vestibular processing differences, unless you kind of used to looking for those things.
Yeah, of course.
So,
Great. So, and again, what we mentioned there about that kind of tolerance to certain things, you said, it's not something necessarily that you grow out of.
Yeah.
It can kind of be that the way that you process that information can, as you develop, still be your the way that you would likely go towards. So, for example, if you've always been car sick, you're likely to remain slightly car sick. So that's those senses. And again, would you say the same when we're talking about brushing our teeth and finding that overwhelming? Is that something that develops over time, or is it something that reduces over time?
Yeah, I think it's almost it's a kind of a double whammy in a sense. So it definitely does develop. I've worked with lots of children who at sort of 2 or 3 will not be able to tolerate any kind of messy play, for example. And I'm talking real strong aversions, children who gag at the thought of putting their hands in paint. But then as they've developed and as they've been exposed to a really sensory enriched environment over a number of years, at the age of 7, now this isn't an issue for them. But that doesn't mean they haven't got other tactile difficulties. So things will develop. But also what also happens for children, for parents and families of children, for schools around children, and as children become adults, they adapt their environment as well. So it might be a child is really oversensitive to sounds, and they just decide that actually a supermarket is not going to be somewhere I'm going to go, or smells, for example, because there's lots of noises with the buzzing of the fridge. You've got the bright lights, you've got different temperatures, you go from really hot to really cold. And some children just can't cope, and instead of growing out of that, they will just decide they'll make that change to their routine and their structure. So there's an element of changing the environment around the child, which is really, really important, and this is part of where our role comes in school and at home. And there's an element then of kind of development, but that development happens with lots of opportunities. And I think this is a key message really, is that we want to enable children to participate in those sensory experiences, but within the realms of what they're comfortable with, because eventually over time that will develop.
So for example then, if we'll go back to the child that finds brushing their teeth too much, it's not that you would persist and push through that and keep using the same toothbrush and still insisting that they complete it, with the 2 minutes or whatever. What you'd actually do is first reduce the demands to be able to build them up. So it'd be possibly using a much softer brush, or or just doing it for a short amount of time,
Yeah.
rather than keep trying at the same level that you've been trying to push through.
Yeah, and if something's not working and you've been trying it for a while, then just doing it the same way is it just shows it's not going to change, if it's not working. And I think that is a really lovely example. There's lots of things you can do. So when you look at an activity on its own, there's things within that activity you could change. So you could say, right, okay, let's try a vibrating toothbrush. Lots of children with sensory needs love vibration. They find it really calming.
Yeah.
It changes the whole ethos around toothbrushing. Lots of children really struggle with the taste of toothpaste. So you can think, right, okay, let's try flavourless toothpaste. Sometimes children really can't cope with the texture of toothpaste. So you can buy the little kind of brushes you can put in the mouth and chew on those, and the bristles will at least help clean the teeth a little bit. So you might make a number of adaptations, and you might try them one at a time. And say, okay, well, let's try this week, and that didn't work, we'll try something else, and maybe that's the thing that works. But alongside that, what you also want to think about is picking your moments. So are we brushing teeth right at the end of the day when your sensory cup is full? So you've been in school all day, maybe you've struggled with how overwhelming school is, maybe you've coped with the noises, the flickering lights in the classroom, the dinner hall, and you've come home from school, you've had homework to do, and by the end of the day, toothbrushing is that final straw really that you can't cope with. So maybe we need to also think about routines, changing, okay, do we only brush teeth in the mornings, or we do it straight from school? And how regulated are you at that point? So we know that the more regulated we are, the more likely we are to be able to cope with additional stimulus. So it might be that we do some calming activities just before toothbrushing, so that then that hasn't changed the activity as such, but it's changed how regulated that child feels in order then to be able to engage in that task. So it's coming at these things from a number of different angles, really.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's just not about simply the toothbrushing.
Yes.
There's so many other factors that could be contributing to that. And that's certainly why we need those detective OT goggles on, don't we? To be able to kind of look past, okay, it might not just be about me getting them to brush their teeth. It might be so much more that's going on here. And
sometimes it's not always sensory. If a child's got poor focus and struggles to sit still for 2 minutes, you need to be relatively still to be able to brush a child's teeth without them hurting themselves. Is it that we need to work on that? So it's about thinking of the bigger picture of that task and that child's own needs and where they're at developmentally and what their sensory needs are, and then going, okay, what can we change about this task and how can we make it more achievable?
Because ultimately what we're trying to do is make sure our children are happy, healthy, safe, and I think when we think about all these different occupations, these jobs that each child has to do, it all contributes, isn't it, to that wider picture of their well-being and enjoying their life, isn't it? So when you think about sensory processing, it is so important for children's daily functioning and their emotional well-being, but why does it contribute so much to that?
I think because we are constantly taking sensory information in. And we're really importantly filtering it out as well. So, as we're talking here now, there are lorries and vans outside that, I'm able to just filter out and not pay attention to and listen and engage in the conversation. There are lots of children who don't have that ability, so they'll be taking sensory information in at the same level. So the teacher might be talking to them, but the light is taking their full attention, that's maybe flickering. The child next to them that's maybe rocking on their chair is giving them that visual input, and that's also given the same amount of attention to that. They'll also be smelling something that maybe the hall has just started cooking food and that smell's coming in. So all at the same time, all this is happening. And actually it's really difficult to be able to focus on what you need to do if you're experiencing that level of input. So there's that element of it, the filtering, but also our senses are really closely aligned to what we've talked about so far is something called sensory modulation. So that's being able to respond appropriately to our senses. What our senses are also really important in terms of our daily lives is our coordination and our movement. So the two outputs of sensory integration, one is the kind of regulation and modulation, and then the other is what we call praxis, which basically means motor planning. So we need all of our senses to work really well to be able to perform pretty much all movements that we perform. So from handwriting to walking up and down the stairs, you need really good vestibular sense to be able to not fall down the stairs. Getting dressed, you stand on one leg, again, really good balance, good vestibular system. So actually, when you talk about the day-to-day life, it's kind of from a being able to do those activities point of view, but also being regulated enough and not overstimulated or overwhelmed that you can't then focus. So it really impacts everything.
It does. I can see when you think about that child, for example, sat in a class trying to listen to the teacher, but also there's someone swinging on the chair, there's smell coming from the canteen. There's the light flickering. There might be the tap in the corner that's dripping. And all the while the child is kind of being given information. So using their senses to take the information from the teacher. But it's just not sticking because all these other senses are kind of overriding that. And I can understand then why children may kind of be misunderstood as having poor attention and concentration, but actually it's very difficult when their senses are kind of overstimulated to be able to give that focus.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really helpful if you look on kind of online videos, there's some really nice videos kind of showing what it's like to be in a bit of a sensory overload. Quite often we show them on training sessions, and there's one in particular where a child's kind of sat in a room and it shows all the different things that are happening, and I find watching it myself that I feel my heart rate going, and I think, oh my gosh, this is a lot of reality for some people. And we talk a lot within my education role about allowing time out of that environment. So creating real nice sensory spaces which are dark, which are very quiet, which allow kind of noises to be blocked out. And they don't have to be an all singing, all dancing sensory room. It can be a space outside of a classroom, which is a little bit more calming. But it just means you get to stop having to process all that information. And that can be enough to just keep that child able to cope well in school.
Because you'll often see some children in class, they'll cover their ears, they'll cover their eyes, because it looks like they're choosing to kind of disengage with the teacher or their learning environment, but actually it's likely because they're overstimulated.
That's it, and this is their coping strategy. And and what and how they've learned to cope. And I think lots of parents will decide, actually, right, okay, I'm not going to put my child in that situation, and you can absolutely see why, because they might go to a children's party, for example, complete sensory overload, and then the child isn't able to perhaps play with their friends or engage or enjoy, and so it might be a decision, okay, well, let's do something on a smaller scale, or let's I think sometimes it's okay to do that. It's okay to think, well, let's just change things around and make them achievable for that child.
Because again, we need to remember, isn't it, that the child's not choosing to do this. This is something that they are unable to fix, isn't it? Because it is something that is kind of overwhelming, like we said about when driving a car and you then realize you get lost, you've got to switch everything off, and because your emotions then are starting to sort of you become dysregulated, and ultimately that's what kind of we need to help our children with, is because that dysregulation really is what's affecting them, isn't it? That's kind of seen as the problem, but actually that's just a symptom. That dysregulation is just a symptom of something else.
Exactly. And it's really hard to learn. It's really hard to engage in what you want to do when you feel that way. Going back to the car analogy, if somebody was to call you at that moment when you're lost and go, oh, I'm just going to give you the shopping list, ingredients, what you need to get, you'd be like, oh, I can't take that in now. I'm lost. I'm dysregulated. So it's about thinking that actually we need to support that child to be as kind of regulated in whatever environment that might be. Home, it might be school, it might be out in the community, to be able to then to get what they need to out of that situation.
And what does that look like then with a child when they become overwhelmed by sensory input? What would we see?
It can look different.
Yeah.
Again, these things are very complex. It can look like a child shutting off. So some children will, when they get sense overloaded by their senses, they will kind of shut down as a coping strategy. They might, like you said, they might cover their ears, they might try and cover their eyes, they might try and leave a room.
Yeah.
They might try and get out of where they are because it's too much. But also you might see meltdowns. So it's really common for a child to have a sensory meltdown.
Okay.
It's not like tantrum. It's not because they want a toy and they can't have it, or another child's taking a toy off them. It's very much like they become so overstimulated by their environment that they don't know what to do, and so they just become very upset.
And these are the type of moments where, I know a lot of people try all sorts of techniques to kind of help a child who's having a meltdown.
Yeah.
Like using distraction. Here, have a chocolate bar. Here, have this. Do this. And those things don't help.
No.
And that's when it becomes, this is more than just a tantrum.
Yeah.
This is something, that they can't kind of snap out of, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I think that's important for parents to know the difference between having a tantrum about not being able to get what they want, or and then a sensory overload is something that
is very different.
Yeah, and often can't be consoled out of.
That's right. You can't console out of it. If you offered something that they normally like, they wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
And also, we need to make sure we're not adding to that sensory overload. So if we use lots of language and kind of say, oh, what about this, what about that, try this, try that, then you add in more sensory input.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to stay calm when a child's having a meltdown. I've been there myself. It's a difficult situation, but you have to almost just be able to ride that out with them and just kind of co-regulate, be there to support them.
Yeah.
But without adding additional kind of sensory input.
So when we talk about this kind of sensory kind of overload, what kind of, in your experience, what kind of situations would cause that for a child?
Typically being in an environment that's just too overloading for them. So sometimes being in school all day and then coming home, and then just, the smallest thing leads to that kind of, like that. Lots of parents will say it's like having a bottle of pop that just explodes when they come home from school. For some children, it's being in a, they've gone to watch gone to the cinema, and it's been what they think a lovely environment, and then at the end, they just can't cope anymore, and that might lead to a meltdown.
So being in a cinema, something that they enjoy, actually then turns into
something that all of a sudden was a bit too much, and you may perhaps hadn't realised, but they've become more and more overwhelmed, and perhaps by the end maybe something small might have happened. But it's just like, always think about a sensory cup filling. You've got a cup and it fills with sensory input all day. We all have things that we do to empty that cup. But for some children, the cup fills quicker. And that one little thing might just make that cup overflow. And once that cup's overflowed, that's kind of then when you might see that meltdown.
So that would be like, relevant to situations where we think, oh, I thought they really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
But actually then, sometimes they're okay with it and sometimes they're not. And is that what you mean then? That sensory cup is kind of filling throughout the day because they might have, maybe you went to the cinema on a weekend where it was, much kind of the whole day itself was much less sensory kind of stimulating. Whereas if you went to the cinema after school, that might have been a step too much for them.
That's right. And also, you could think of factors like sleep, food, were they hungry, So the how we feel inside our own bodies will have an impact on how we cope with the sensory input that our bodies are taking in. So if you've had a really poor night's sleep, and maybe you haven't eaten very much that day, you're already kind of more, I suppose, predisposed to kind of reacting to that sensory input. So at that point, then maybe that child might go into the cinema tired, hungry, and that information is too much. And the following week, you might go in and they've had a really good night's sleep, had a really good day, nothing really has gone wrong on that day, and then they're much more regulated and happy, and that sensory input is okay. And I have these conversations with class teachers a lot, because they'll say, well, we were practicing for the Christmas play, and on Tuesday they were brilliant. They sat there all day, they sat there for the whole session, and they coped. And then on Wednesday they couldn't cope. And it's like, well, okay, maybe they, what happened on Tuesday morning, what happened on Wednesday morning? We don't know what dysregulates. What's dysregulating them, and that goes for us as adults. There are days when I might cope absolutely fine if my children are having an argument with them, between themselves. And then there are other days when I might feel a little bit more stressed, and that noise is enough to, push me over the edge. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I do find that even just thinking about myself, as I can function, Monday to Friday, but the thought of going food shopping on a Friday or Saturday and being surrounded by people, for me, is just like, oh no, I can't, because when you think about that, the drip drip effect throughout the week. So it's not just like a daily bucket, is it?
No.
It can be that week, and knowing that, it's knowing yourself as well, to be able to understand your children as well, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think it's really important that, we always say this in our Tonight Talks, is about, first, before we can understand our children, that we need to understand ourselves, because we're not perfect, and you've got a sensory cup, so have I, and sometimes they overflow,
right.
because of life.
Yeah,
It's so changeable and unpredictable, and
it is,
can be really difficult at times, isn't it?
It can. And I think, as adults, we know what helps us, and we have to support children to learn what helps them. What are the activities that they engage with that they find helpful to empty that sensory cup? So for some children, that's being in the outdoors. Some children, that's getting lots and lots of movement, spinning, running around. For some children, they like lots of deep pressure, so really deep hugs, or
wrapped up in a blanket.
Squishes, wrapped in a blanket. And for other children, that looks like kind of zoning out, being in their own space, and being left kind of just to kind of process everything for a short amount of time. So it's about learning what works to empty that cup as well.
Yeah, exactly. And thinking about, when all these different types of sensory experiences, can be overwhelming. Obviously, we talked about all the different factors that contribute to it. You mentioned about children kind of being over responsive to things. What does it mean when a child is under responsive then to sensory input?
So it just means that they're not getting enough of that information into their brain. So our brain is picking up all the sensory information, and sometimes too much of it is taken in, and sometimes not enough is taken in.
Right. Okay.
And in the under responsive, there's not enough. So it's nothing wrong with the actual sense itself, but how the brain is perceiving that information, it isn't, the messages are not quite going through, or they're not going through fast enough. So sometimes you might have a child who, from a tactile, so from a touch point of view, if they're under responsive, they wouldn't necessarily notice if they were dirty. So they might just have a really dirty face and not feel that. They might be under responsive to sounds and then not hear their name being called, and kind of not really notice the environment around them. If they're under responsive to vestibular input, then they kind of, again, they don't detect as much movement. And when a child is under responsive, not always, but quite often, they will seek that input. So if a child's under responsive to tactile input or touch, they might then want to touch everything. So they'll touch everything within their space. They want to touch somebody's hair, maybe, or somebody's clothing. They want to get messy. They love all that messy play. And if a child's under responsive in their vestibular system, they will seek movement. So they want to spin, they want to run around, they need that, because it's almost like they're not getting it, so they seek it.
And can that also, so talking about being, so they're under responsive, but then they seeking it. So actually what they're trying to get that feedback that they're missing in a way. And does that, I'm just thinking about in terms of like, with siblings, but in schools, we hear a lot about children kind of pushing others, or, and actually, I think sometimes when we see that behavior, it's like they're seeking that connection in a way, but not realizing the force.
Is that something that, that's where our proprioception system comes in. So our proprioception system is what allows us to judge the force of our movements. It's a kind of our internal body mapping. So if you were to close your eyes, you'd be able to move your arms and legs. You'd know which direction they were moving in, because your joints and your muscles are talking to your brain, basically. And that also then comes into using the right amount of force. Lots of children who have proprioceptive differences will then seek that input. So they love jumping, because when you jump, all your joints will stack on top of each other and give a nice a bit of pressure. Or like you said, they'll push, and again, not intentionally. They might be really heavy-handed or really heavy-footed, but not necessarily intentionally. They just don't know how to judge that force. So a child with proprioception kind of difficulties will quite often struggle with things like using the right amount of force when writing even, so press really hard on the paper to the point the paper will cut. Ball skills will be difficult because they'll try and throw the ball gently, but it'll go really far, or vice versa. And then you'll see things like wanting to sometimes chew, because the jaw is one of our big joints. So people want to bite because they get lots of feedback, proprioceptive feedback through the jaw. So that kind of crash bang behaviour is quite often proprioception.
Okay. And is that, when you talked about the jaw then as well, does that relate to, say, younger children who may bite? We hear that a lot.
Again, I think it's being a detective. So some children will bite because they've learned that it's a behaviour that serves them a purpose at some point.
They get a response.
They get a response. Yeah, exactly. Biting and chewing on things is a developmental stage as well. So with our tactile system, so our sense of touch, it develops in our mouth and our finger, in our mouth, sorry, before our body. So when babies mouth items, it's because they can tell the texture of it with their mouth more so than their hand. And then you come past that developmental stage and your hands develop. So, could they be biting because maybe developmentally that's where they're at? Thinking about some children perhaps with global delay, or perhaps they're at that age, or they're at that stage. Sometimes it can be a consequence, but sometimes, it could be that they like that feedback. And I think usually when it's needing the feedback, children will look for different types of things to bite. So they like biting things that are, biting the sleeves on their top is a common thing that we see. Chewing on any kind of thing that they can really get in and give a good chew on. So again, it's something that isn't quite straightforward. So you have to really pick apart what's going on for that child.
And that's important, isn't it? About, like you said, being that detective to seeing, okay, chewing is maybe the outcome, but what's going on behind that, isn't it? So it's so interesting, isn't it? These, talking about under-responsive children then seeking it. So you would wonder that someone that was a child that was biting is obviously, I'd assume then under-responsive
to reception. And then is possibly seeking it. And what we try and do is we try and cluster behaviours together. So if a child was only doing that, but then didn't have any other signs of proprioception differences, then we might say, okay, perhaps they're biting because they've, like we said, they've learned that got them the reaction that they needed. But if they're also perhaps seeking out jumping or squashing themselves, they respond really well to deep pressure. Perhaps they, like lots of children like force against their head as well. So we'll push the head into different things, push their jaw. So you look and you would think, oh, okay, there's 4 or 5 things here that's happening that all point in the direction that it might be proprioception. Then we would kind of make that assumption and try those strategies. Because we can't see the process that's happening inside us. So we have to kind of become detectives, put together all the behaviours and go, oh, right, that looks like that's that. Let's try those strategies. And sometimes it's trial and error. Things work. And then sometimes they don't work and we say, okay, perhaps it wasn't that, and let's try something else.
So in terms of signs of sensory seeking behaviour in children, what are some of the other signs that we can look out for?
Okay, so just thinking about the different senses. So if your child's seeking, for example, in their sense of smell, they might want to sniff everything. They might kind of be going around and needing to smell. They might crave strong smells. If they're seeking in their taste, they might be a child that really likes strong flavoured things. So choosing foods that are typically quite strong, that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily associate a child eating, like an olive or a really spicy curry, for example. So that would be a child possibly seeking from a taste point of view. Seeking from a tactile perspective or touch, similar to what I said earlier, wanting or needing to touch everything. Wanting to be messy, loving messy play. If you were seeking from a hearing perspective, you might make your own noises. So if you've got a child that likes lots of auditory input, they would want to be in,
don't you know,
that's
like
it,
that rumble.
Humming. And sometimes the auditory one is a difficult one, because sometimes children will make noises and you think, they're seeking that. But sometimes they make the noises because they're not actually seeking, they're actually oversensitive to sounds. But what they don't like is the unpredictability of a sound. So if you're in a classroom or say you're in the living room of your house and it's silent, then any small noise will sound a lot louder than if there's a bit of background noise, for example. So at that point, children then become a little bit worried about the fact that it's so quiet. So then they might hum, because that provides that bit of background noise. So if, say, a pencil's dropped, it doesn't sound as loud.
It's like a fright, isn't it, in a way?
They don't get that fright reaction if there's background noise. So sometimes when you look at the environment, you think, oh, actually, are they seeking that noise, or are they making that noise because they're fearful of other unpredictable noises? And you can just try background noise and see if that makes a difference then.
Because it's interesting, when you think about the senses, and how they contribute to the, fears, so when we talk about, babies, and when they're born, the only things that we should kind of be afraid of born, from birth is fear of loud noise and fear of falling, and they tie into those senses.
They do. And our senses develop, right early on in the womb. But of course, we're in a really nice protected space. And that when we talk about creating a nice sensory environment, we often use the term womb spaces, because the womb is dark, sounds are muffled, you're in water, and you're squashed in. And being squashed and is really regulated. So you're having lots of proprioceptive input. You're getting nice vestibular input. So you're kind of not spinning around, but you're getting that kind of rocking, which is quite calming. Sounds are muffled. You've got that kind of background noise of the heartbeat. So it's a very calming environment. So we talk a lot about kind of recreating that in the outside world.
Oh, I hear so much with new parents saying the only way we could get the baby to sleep was to drive them around in the car. And that's very similar, isn't it? It's movement, it's the humming of the engine,
or you rock them and then you put them down and they're still, and they're not in your arms, and all of a sudden they wake straight up.
I know. It is. It's fascinating how it all just ties in, isn't it? We're a very complex thing, aren't we, the human?
We are, very.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, what we're thinking about babies and as they develop, and adults as well. What type of daily activities naturally support our sensory integration then?
So I would say this isn't necessarily an activity, but the outdoors. Outdoors is really good for our sensory systems. Children play a lot more in the outdoors. They develop all the different senses in the outdoors. Children are a lot more motivated to kind of move their body in different ways, really, when they're outdoors. They'll climb, they will balance. If you walk from one point to another as an adult, you'll just walk. A child will find a wall to climb along. They'll run up a hill, they'll roll back down. They'll find things in the outdoors that will really help, and all of those things will help to develop their senses. So whether it's the vestibular sense because they're moving in different ways, whether it's the tactile sense because they're touching different things, they're seeing lots of different, so many different things that the outdoors offers. So it's not an activity in itself, but it's just being outdoors, going to the park, being in a range of different types of environment, really.
And that's why parks are so important. When you think about all the different, they've got different, like textiles, wood, metal, plastic.
That's right.
Things that are slippery, things that are rough. You've got those little bridges that they've got in chain bridges they wobble across, and they're up and down, and they're so busy, but you can see they're getting so much from it.
So much out of it. And when you climb, your joints are pulled to the right to the end that they can go. So because you're holding your body weight. So you're climbing up the climbing frame or up a ladder, and then you get lots of vestibular input when you go down a slide, and then you've got things that will spin you around. Type movement again. So there's so many different things that a park offers.
But also the sense for them is that, like, they're doing something that's active, but also they're happy, and that's so important for our children, isn't it? To have a place where they go to, where they just feel like they're climbing things, they're achieving things, they're doing hard things as well, but that motivation to get across that bridge, even though it's really wobbly, they're going to do it, and that's developing the resilience, that motivation. I think that's really, that perseverance as well of climbing up. You see little kids trying to climb up the fireman's pole.
They don't give up.
No, they don't give up, and isn't that lovely? They're just lovely. So determined. It's great,
It's you know, there's a part of our brain that as a child is innate to want to move and to want to be involved in these activities. It changes, you know, when you're an adult, you're quite happy to sit on the park bench and watch. But when you're a child, you've got a drive in you to do things quite repetitively. And that's because by doing that, then that develops your senses, which help to develop your coordination, your ability to do everything, basically.
Yeah, and that's the thing was we noticed with the little children, you know, they are, you know, their senses, as you can see, are developing, you know, and it's so important that we give them these opportunities, isn't it?
100%. Yeah. Lots of opportunities.
So you were talking about routine. Obviously, us adults love a routine.
Yeah, we do.
If we can stick to it.
Yeah.
But you know, what kind of, you know, how can routine support sensory needs? But we also don't want to add extra work for parents because it is hard, you know, parenting. But you know, when we're thinking about the sensory kind of integration for our children, what can we do there?
I think it's thinking about your child's individual needs and making a routine that works for them. So for some children, the ones that come out of school like a bottle of pop, maybe to go into the park straight after school and getting all that pushing and pulling and movement might be the factor that helps so that when you get home, you haven't then got that meltdown. Quite often when I talk to parents, the strategies are the real simple ones. And we have conversations like, oh, I didn't think of that. That's really an obvious thing to try. So it's not always complicated. It's the little things that we can do. So things like, you know, a child is a bit more dysregulated in school, they don't eat very much. Having that snack as soon as they come out of school, so they eat straight away. It might be, you know, carrying a heavy rucksack on they walk home from school because that's going to give some proprioceptive feedback. So it's about adding those things into the routine. And we, you know, lots of people talk about kind of sensory diets or sensory circuits and lots of different sensory terminology, but actually little things that we can do little and often throughout the day can be that thing that makes the big change.
So, and even simply, like, you know, we find a lot of parents saying, you know, I ask them how their day is after, you know, when they come out of school, what have you done today? You know, what was the favourite thing about today? And it's just like, it's too much, isn't it? You know, and sometimes it's just to give them that space to just not talk to you about the place they've just come from, which has been very overwhelming sometimes, isn't it?
And as adults, you know, we have a drive home sometimes, don't we? We're in work and we drive home. And that's our time to decompress a little bit. Nobody's talking at us. And by the time you get home, you might be ready. And so for children, they get picked up from school and get questions straight away. So that's absolutely right. You know, and some children that don't respond as well to movement but need a quieter space, that for that routine would be factoring that into their day. It might be that you need to do things in the morning that are different. So for some children, getting dressed can be a real issue if they've got tactile difficulties. The feel of clothing on their body is really hard to manage. So you might decide as a parent you're going to do some like really nice regulation strategies before, you know, maybe put some yoga on, which is going to give you some nice you know, some nice proprioceptive feedback. You might do some of that deep squashes that we talked about before you get dressed. So
it's like about preparing the skin.
You can brush the skin with things like different sponges, and again you're preparing the skin. So it's about maybe thinking about that routine, and that might be just allowing a bit of extra time in the morning. So it's very personal, depends on the child's needs, but it's definitely worth investing that time into adding in some of those strategies.
So what can parents start to do when we think about like seeing their child through those goggles, you know, what can parents start observing with their children?
I think, you know, as you said, become a sensory detective. Start thinking about what's going on for that child, seeing the bigger picture. What are their needs that have been met so far that day? Have they slept? Have they ate? Are they okay? You know, with what's going on generally in life for them? What are their strengths? What makes them tick, and what makes them unhappy? And then thinking about the demands of this sensory environment and whether that is a difficulty for them. So when you look at your child, look at their behaviours, look at what tells you they're not enjoying a certain sensory aspect. So if they're a child that doesn't like getting dressed or only will wear shorts, maybe need their labels cut out the clothes, and you might think, okay, well, that's a tactile. This is a touch. Tactile element. If you notice they're always putting their hands over their ears, if you notice that every Tuesday they come out of school much more dysregulated, you might have that chat with the teacher to say, okay, so what happens every Tuesday? And it's assembly day. And you might go, right, that makes perfect sense.
Yes, yeah.
Do they need to go to assembly? It's not always, the most important thing. So sometimes some schools will say, okay, we'll do something different.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll do half the assembly.
Yeah.
So it's about, as a parent, I suppose, just looking and seeing what you observe. Sometimes it's really helpful to write things down before you see a pattern.
Yeah.
Obviously, parents can talk to us. Parents can look. We've got there's lots of really lovely websites that parents can access with ideas, with hints and tips.
And you're going to give us those, so we can put that in the
yes, you can
the Tonight Talks description.
Yeah,
that'd be
we'll
really
give you
helpful.
give you some links that you can add to that. And then I suppose, don't be afraid to try strategies. So nothing really causes harm in terms of our sensory strategy. So if you decide, oh, I might try some of the deep hugs, and the child goes, oh, I don't like that.
Yeah.
That's fine. You tried it, and you might decide, I'm going to try it for a few days and try it again, because things don't always work first time, as we know. But there's no harm done in giving things a try. You might say, okay, I'm going to try the park every day after school for a couple of weeks, and actually the child gets more dysregulated. You go, right, that didn't work. So I would say it's about not be afraid to try new things, and monitor how they respond.
And it's also, I think it's important, isn't it? What you're saying here is, it's not to treat the symptom, it's to look at the cause, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is the trick, isn't it? To seeing, okay, what could be causing this dysregulation?
Yeah.
Causing them to either get dysregulated or withdraw.
Yeah.
We need to sort of understand that, and it's great that you've pinpointed our parents to some websites where you can try different strategies based on what you might be seeing. Come to the end of our Tonight Talks, and it's been really, really interesting, and it's certainly going to make me think far more in detail about our senses, not just those 5 senses that it's about those 8, isn't it, that we've got going on there, and what that looks like for our children. But before we end today, Kylie, I'd really like to, we like to end our Tonight Talks with some top tips.
Great.
But if there was one message from today's session that you just want parents to sort of take away with, what would that be?
I think for me, it would be the importance of movement, of children being able to move in lots of different ways, whether that be outdoors, whether it be in the park, whether it be, at home, having different things like, I don't know, a trampoline, or a swing in the doorway, in school, being able to get up from their desk and move around and have lots of movement breaks. I think all our senses are very reliant on lots of input all the time, and we quite often overlook the fact that our vestibular system needs that input as well, and how closely linked that is to regulation and our development, and just being able to kind of do what we did 20 years ago, when children would climb trees, get dirty in mud, we didn't worry about germs as much, and that really helped to develop our senses. So I think it would be, just to get out there and be as in a enriched environment from a sensory perspective as possible.
And I think, it's something that is really important that we mention, is about the barrier to that.
Yeah.
Sadly, these days are electronic devices.
That's right.
They keep our children very still.
They do.
They keep them very fixated on one sort of sensory input, in a way, using their eyes and things like that. And actually, they're not moving, not having that movement that you said. And I know parents, they use devices in ways that can help family life. Actually, what it's doing is preventing our children from developing those good sensory kind of networks, isn't it, in our bodies?
That's absolutely right. And I think, as I said earlier, children have an innate drive to want to move and to want to roll around and do all sorts of strange things with their bodies. But the one thing that seems to kind of override that is a screen. They're so addictive, aren't they? And we all use them, but I think it's having that knowledge to go, okay, we need to have time to kind of to do things that are more physical.
Yes, exactly. And for those parents who are struggling with technology in their home, we do have a Tonight Talks on tackling technology, it's called. So I'll make sure that's in the episode description for today as well. So for those of you who are struggling, where a lot of our parents are, you can have a listen to that as well, which will just help general overall well-being for our children. Thank you so much, Carly. It's been a pleasure to have you.
You're
And
welcome.
we'd love to welcome you back as well, because I'm sure there's lots that you can talk about in your two different jobs. So, but yeah, before we go, on the screen you can see there that we've got a QR code for links to all our other Tonai Talks on a range of different subjects. And also we've got a QR code for if you'd like to ask us a question for our Tonai Tavi Tonai Talk, which is all about answering parents' dilemmas. So please, if you do have a question about your child, you can submit that to us and we'll do our best to answer it. But for now, diolch yn fawr, thank you for joining us for our Tonai Talks with Carly on Inside the Senses.